straight on to Ole Røgeberg, and then we'll have a general time for questions and discussion afterwards.
I've never used this thing. Yeah, okay, I think say something. I'm going to, let me first just say this warning or caveat that my background is that I am an economist. I'm interested in drug policy, I'm interested in regulation and questions surrounding that, but this sort of political trend analysis of what's happening in the world and so on is not really my field, it's not really my methods. So this is more my personal take on how things are changing. Whether this is the best or whether it's even a plausible interpretation is up to you to decide. So, having said that, I think it's one way I like to think about it is to think about the drug war as the reaction to a crisis. I mean, from our perspective, it might seem a bit like exaggerated, and it has a lot of negative consequences. But I think you could say that some people might have seen it very differently in the 60s and 70s. If we think about the illegal drug use, it was perceived as new substances, even though cannabis and heroin had been available before, or had existed before for many years. They hadn't been used in large numbers amongst young people, so there was this sudden and frightening increase in use amongst young people. And the beliefs that a lot of people seemed to have was that people would start with experimentation with some mild drug like cannabis, and then that would increase in use, and they would use more and more. They would escalate through the drug staircase and start using harder drugs, and they would in turn become socially marginalized, they would be mentally unstable, they would get physical disease, and they would die. And if you have that perspective on drugs, I think it's fair to say that that is a crisis. It is something that demands a very swift and strong response. I'm not saying that everyone who implemented these policies necessarily shared all of these beliefs, but I think that this is a picture of drugs that was quite widespread at the time. So in 1971, the reason I put the drug war up here is that it came in 1971. It was a phrase that was popularized by Nixon, and he declared drugs as the public enemy number one. Now that's, public enemy number one, that's the top one. So it's not one of our problems, it's the public enemy number one, and he framed the answer as a war on drugs. And as a result, we had this quite aggressively enforced international prohibition that was ramped up. We saw ramping up even in Norway in terms of the sentencing, in terms of if you look at the number of arrests in Norway that had to do with drugs, they were around, I think it was 2,000 or something in or less in the 70s, and they escalated and escalated, and now we have, I think, around 40,000 per year. And then in 2009, the drug czar, the guy in charge of the drug policy in the US, he said, we're no longer going to be talking about a war on drugs, we're retiring the phrase. And he said, I think his name was Jørgen, he said, regardless of how you try and explain it to people, that it's a war on drugs or a war on a product, people see a war as a war on them. We are not at war with people in this country. Now I mean, I'm not going to put too much emphasis on the drug war as a concept, but I think it's symbolic in a way of this slow shift that we've had away from what I would call a crisis mode. Away from it. So, and the shift has, and this is something that has been touched upon earlier today, has been towards seeing this as something that should be dealt with as a health policy rather than through criminal justice. So this is just a timeline of some of the things that I think that we've seen over the years. In 1994, Switzerland had a large-scale trial of heroin maintenance. Before that, I mean, they had this system of doctors giving heroin to addicts in UK, amongst other places, in the 50s and so on. But for this new addict population, this was new. And I've seen experts, like at the time, who said that this was you couldn't do this in practice because they would need to get heroin so many times, they wouldn't be able to show up on time. Then they said that this was just practically not feasible. And then Switzerland did it, and they had a quite good and rigorous evaluation. And other evaluations, randomized clinical trials in Netherlands and in other countries, they've had one in Canada. And now these are standard in Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the UK. They're not a big part of the treatment system. Generally, they're about 5 to 10% of the treatment slots in total when it comes to, if you look at the opiate maintenance substitution. Most of them get other things, but it's there. The second thing that I would mention is California's Proposition 215 in 1996, which was the first sort of medical marijuana law which was introduced through a ballot measure. So these came from sort of the bottom up. They were popular grassroots initiatives organized by legalization organizations, and they now cover 23 states. In 2000, Portugal removed the criminal penalties for all drug use. They're not the first ones to remove or change penalties, but this was a very sort of highly publicized event. Lots of people heard about it, lots of people discussed it. It's still being discussed. Then in 2009, there were 3 former presidents from Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico in Latin America who chaired a Latin American Commission on Drug Policy and who wanted to sort of, they said, break the taboo on debate. And this was followed up 2 years later by the Global Commission on Drug Policy, who also called for a break in the taboo on debate and reform, which we've already heard about. 2013, the Organization of American States released a major report on the drug problem in the Americas, and they said that we had to sort of dare to think in new ways and to consider new possible policies. The Latin American leaders were also very important in spearheading the efforts that have resulted in a forthcoming UN special session on global drug policy that is going to be held in 2016. And finally, in 2012, we had the legalization of recreational marijuana in Colorado and Washington State. And then in 2013, Uruguay became the first nation to do so as well. Now, of course, you could have made many lists like this, and you could have made lists that have elements that go in different directions and that show like different things. But the reason I put these things up is that I think they sort of point to 3, what I would call pillars that are supporting the reform movement globally. But before I get to, so I'll give you, because I think this is being driven by different things, but they do support one another. So a quick illustration of the US story. This is Americans' views on the legalization of marijuana by age. And you see amongst young people, 18 to 29, 67% think it should be legal. There's 62% in the 30 to 49 age bracket, and there's then it goes down. And if you come to the group that's 65 plus, that's where you start to see numbers go down, and you no longer have a majority. So there's a majority up to 64 years of age. And this is related, to a large extent, to their use. This is the lifetime use, the past year use, and the past month use for different age groups in the US. And as you can see, the 65 plus, they are the people who were born and had their youth before cannabis was widely in use in the US. So there's a demographic transition. There are people here who have used this drug in their youth. You can see the use rates amongst people around their 20s is quite high. 30% have used it in the past year. And they tend to, there's also been some research from Australia which suggests that people who have tried cannabis or used cannabis, or who have friends or people they know who have used cannabis, tend to become more positive to a more liberal policy as a result, and that persists even after they themselves have stopped using. Because as you can see, the older people here are no longer using in large numbers, but they have used and they remain quite liberal. And this is the outcome. So we see that there's been some changes over time here, but now we have a majority that are pro-legalization of recreational marijuana in the states. And after the legalization in the 2 states, it's, if anything, I mean, this is like one data point here, so we should be careful, but if anything, it looks like this is they're starting to diverge even more. And yes, as mentioned before, there are 3 states that have valid initiatives for legalization this November. In some form, 2 that will allow sale, and 1 that will only allow home cultivation. And I think that's going to be very important. Well, California obviously is going to be more important as a single instance, but this will help to sort of set. I think that if these fail, the argument can be made that, well, people want to wait and see what happens. If they continue to legalize in different states, I think people will be starting to talk about some sort of trend or that they're on a train that is moving fast. So we'll see that. But the reason I mentioned this a little in detail is because these are very different from the things that have been discussed in Latin America. The way I see it, and this may be wrong, and I'm oversimplifying here, but in Latin America, it seems the reform initiatives have been driven by political leaders who are attempting to reduce violence and corruption and crime. They are the supplier countries. They are the countries who have been that have been destabilized by huge drug gangs with lots of money that have had a horrible impact on their communities, and they're trying to find a way to reduce that. In the US, on the other hand, I would say that the reforms have largely been in cannabis policy, and they have been driven by demographic shift and the change in public opinions. And it was mentioned this medicalization, and I think there's a difference between the medicalization in the US states and the medicalization that we see with heroin here in Norway, in the sense that if Ethan Nadelman, who is one of the chief sort of workers for legalization in the US and who has been active in this since the 70s, he said in an interview that one of his goals was to change the perception of the marijuana user by finding like who are the people who are suffering because of the prohibition. It's the people who could have been helped in a medical use. But that has the second impact that when people think about a cannabis user, they're no longer thinking about a long-haired stoner sitting in the park and maybe going off to India to meet a guru. Now they're thinking about their aunt who's in chemotherapy, and it's no longer as frightening. So that changes the image of the drug. It changes it in a very fundamental way. And finally, I would say that Europe and Canada, the third pillar, we have seen reforms that are driven by an increasing focus on the health and the social outcomes of drug users, often termed harm reduction. So these are three sort of different ways that sort of converge in terms of driving reforms in this area. And in the short run, I can't really see any sort of major things that are going to change in this picture. So, and that's really the only way that I have of judging whether this trend is likely to continue or not. I can't see any countervailing trends. The countries that are now the foremost fighters for prohibition and for strict prohibition tend to be now countries such as Russia and countries with a poor human rights record. Whereas the arguments are now, even in Norway, you see that it's more and more acceptable to talk about the dangers of the black market. So for instance, we criminalize cannabis, but by doing so, we're also creating a black market so that the youth that we're trying to protect get in touch with the criminal market that recruits them and makes them criminals as well. So these kinds of, there's like, the debate has changed, and although in Norway I don't think the argument in terms of Latin America and the supplier countries tends to be downgraded in Norway because we say that that's so far away, it's not really relevant to us, this is not where we get our supplies, the marijuana we get comes from other places, these are the primary things to worry about. But all in all, as we've seen in this Global Drug Commission, it is state leaders and people from all these different countries with these three different perspectives that tend to come together and collectively forge a new way forward. Thank you.